Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Lauren Johnston, and I'm going to present to you today on Africa's population structure and development. What reference, if any, or what relevance is China's approach to population and development? It might surprise you. Before I begin, thanks very much to our hosts, University of Ghana, for having me here today, for accepting my abstract. And I look forward to the discussion. So got just 15 minutes, so I'll get into it. So my next slide, if I can get there. There we go. Presentation structure. So just give a quick survey of Africa's demographic dividend, like a survey of how close it is in which countries, or if it's even on the horizon in some places. And then second, the evolution of aging in China since 1970, or basically the demographic transition in China. So how it happened and how it's progressed. And the third section will be this concept that came from China of getting old before getting rich, which was an analytical product of the one-child policy. And it's that analytical product, not the policy, that I'm going to tap into here. And then just looking at that, so today China is already old, but it's still a middle income economy, not a high income one. Can poor old China get rich? And then finally, China's economic demography transition approach as a reference point for African countries, no matter where they are in economic demography context. So part one, proximity of demographic dividends. So if you take this as so table one is basically the 4 different demographic dividend thresholds that the World Bank has in their World Development Indicators database that get updated each year. So if you take a country where the total fertility rate is 4.9 or higher, or the share of youth is 43.2%, or the elder share just 2.8%, that's pre-dividend. So a country that basically hasn't entered the demographic transition, which would be somewhere like Niger. And then you kind of, fast forward to the other end, you have the post-dividend countries, which is more like Japan. There isn't like maybe Mauritius, actually, let me go forward. So post-demographic dividend is basically when it's passed and you have a high elder share. So you see, this is a kind of, it's not perfect. It doesn't tell you the speed of transition, but by having a look at where countries are around these thresholds, you can get a sense of how close they are to the dividend period, if they're in the dividend period or even if they're past it. So this is actually that from the data from the year before. I didn't have time to update it. So low total fertility rate society, which is the countries that are above the post-demographic dividend threshold level, there aren't any in Africa today. But the kind of late demographic dividend, in between the late and the post, is Mauritius. So that's basically, at least by child share, that's Africa's oldest country. And then in terms of the kind of in the middle of, in the prime of, and in the late end of the demographic dividend, you have the Seychelles, Tunisia, Morocco, Libya, and Cape Verde. And then you can see the most interesting thing is that the vast majority of countries are demographic dividend prospect, which means, at least by this child share indicator, these countries are kind of heading toward or getting into their demographic dividends. So the demographic transition has begun. These fruits really must be prepared for and captured with a vengeance, the way they were in China. And those are the countries which have the highest prospect of doing that in terms of where they are demographically. And then in the last line, you have the countries that have still very high total fertility rate, high child share. They haven't necessarily entered the demographic transition yet. So which I note includes most of the larger populations in Africa, or at least it includes Nigeria, Tanzania, and so on. So these are some of Africa's, Uganda, some of Africa's larger populations. So there's a lot of youth richness in Africa, but transition toward a demographic dividend for the largest share of countries. And basically the same pattern if you look at the elder share, just to confirm. So why on earth is China relevant to that story? So just to understand, how did China become this now very rapidly aging country? So back in 1960 and in the 1960s, China had it promoted natality. So it had this, it was up around 6.5 births per woman, which may even be higher than Niger and other countries today. So, and then in the 1970s, the policies and the priorities shifted. So you had this, what was called the Later, Longer, Fewer campaign. So have children later, wait longer between them, and have fewer of them overall. And that actually, not the one-child policy, is what led to this dramatic, so you can see that dramatic decline in the total fertility rate across the 1970s. And then in 1980, a one-child policy was introduced. And I guess that was implemented in part to make sure that the large cohorts born in the 1960s and late 1950s didn't all go on to have 2 or 3 children each, because that would have really created a very, very large population. And there was an explicit campaign started in 1978 to try to modernize the economy. And China decided at that point to foster at least a slower population growth rate such that it could elevate living standards per capita. It turns out the same process has happened by virtue of education and healthcare and choice and so on in other countries. So it doesn't mean a country has to implement such a policy to end up with the same demographic pattern. And then a consequence of that was, you can see this huge population of working age dividend from around 1980 until around 2010. So by virtue of China's, intensive becoming the factory of the world era from around 1980, but especially the 1990s and 2000s, you can see the logic of that in terms of China's demographics. Like at that time, China was full of not very highly educated, very cheap labor, and they grabbed that for everything they could in terms of high productivity per capita, foreign exchange accumulation, technology absorption, attracting foreign investment. They really kind of match their demographics and their economic objectives very well. But today, so it's slightly dated, but same thing. Today, population pyramid no more. Now you have a much older population, and also you have the beginning of a small population of people aged over 80. So a lot of aging now, and getting even more rapid in China. So that low wage, cheap, young, not very well educated population is just not there anymore as it was earlier. And that's not going to change based on median variant projections anytime soon, even though China has launched a 3-child policy. To some extent, that's for richer families. That's not that everyone will have 3 children. It's also, even if everybody did, there's fewer people today in childbearing ages. So it wouldn't be the same as if in 1980 to 1990, everyone had 3 children. But probably most will have 1 or 2 in any case, but just a minority can now have 3. So basically aging is the trajectory. But in China's case, they have planned that the younger cohorts will ideally keep becoming richer per capita and have elevated standards of living. So this is their whole kind of economic demography transition process. So just one last look, you can see this is the median age. So in 1980, China's median age wasn't that much higher than the average of the whole African continent today. And by 2050, at least based on these projections, or even today by 2020, it's basically doubled. Like the median age in China has doubled, the median age in Africa has barely moved. So that just tells you the difference of demographics over that time. If this was China versus Mauritius, it might be quite similar, but it's China and the entire African average. So you can see the difference. So, but just to add, like on the one hand, Africa is very young, but China really isn't the only aging country. If you look at countries, these baselines are a bit random from a paper I wrote, 1996 and 2016, 20 years, that in 1996, 31% of countries were old by share of old, but by 2016, that was 42% nearly. And then by share of young, now 61% or more by 2021, probably something closer to 65%. So you can see that countries are getting older and older by these threshold indicators, but they're not necessarily getting richer at the same rate. And so aging is this old before rich as a new development norm. So this concept of old before getting rich, or alternatively, as you can put it for economists, old not rich. So you're old and you're still a low or middle income country, more likely middle income. Old not rich. What are the origins and consequence? So in the 1970s, China implemented those agendas, as I said. And then in 1978, they began this modernization program. And then they were quite lucky, actually. The day after they launched that, the UN passed a resolution on attending to population aging issues. This is in 1978. And then in 1980, China announced the one-child policy for reasons just mentioned. And that led to then the people who attended the UN, then the 1978 resolution of the UN led to a conference in 1982. And a number of Chinese bureaucrats attended that and kind of loosely set up China's population aging architecture, very, very loosely at that point, but at least it had some representatives. And meantime, the one-child policy encouraged a lot of thinking, wow, what will be the impacts of this demographic change? But you see that in places like Vietnam, South Korea, and maybe even Mauritius, these demographic changes took place anyway, but without the policy responsibility. So China had this policy responsibility, and they thought, wow, what will be the implications? We have to be ready. We have to make sure getting old before rich doesn't become an obstacle to getting rich. And then this became the foundations of what I call China's economic demography transition approach. So why was it a concern? Because all of China's rich neighbors had got rich when they were young. China thought, wow, maybe there's not even a way to get rich after you get old. China would still be trying to join the frontier when it had to shift human and physical financial resources toward caring for the old. So this would be a drag on productivity and a premature loss of labor cost advantages. So not just a labor supply loss, but also there'd be wage inflation because there'd be much more constraints on labor availability and so on. So loss of labor competitiveness and so on. So China thought, wow, how can we overcome? How can we possibly get rich after getting old? Is that even possible? And they used the notion of old before rich to help them move in that direction. So they were afraid also because they would start aging basically around when the rural labor. So under the Lewis model, we have rural labor moving into the urban and industrial sectors, and that gives you rapid productivity gains. In China's case, that coincided with the demographic dividend. So you had like development and ready productivity and per capita growth gains on steroids almost. And then the supply of rural cheap labor ran out about the same time that more people started retiring than entering the workforce. So you've got this double whammy of kind of wage inflation risks, labor supply risks, and so on. Unless you find a way to at least attempt to maintain a constant level of effective labor, which is what China has tried to do. But so just in context of what did China have to do? China is in this bottom, at least back then, 1980, China was in the bottom left corner. It's poor and young. And rather than moving into the bottom right corner and getting young and rich, it would become poor and old first and then hope to move. But what you can see implicit in this scatter plot is that actually now most countries are getting old before they're getting rich. But this wasn't true in the 1980s. So China was very afraid because it was looking to Japan and Singapore and so on, not to what's happening today. So, you know, I just like to put these kind of in a very binary context. You can say there's poor countries and rich countries, and then young countries and old countries. You have these kind of four binary types of country. So in China's case, it would go from poor young to poor old and have to become rich old from there. That pathway might not be possible. So this is just a kind of a fast forward map to today. And just to see, like, China thought it was the only poor old, or would be the only poor old country because of the one-child policy. But all of these yellow countries are poor and old, at least in terms of these binary 7%, 65% or more of the population over 65. So all the yellow countries are poor and old today, but probably none of them have been thinking about the fact they'll be old before rich like China has. So maybe some countries in Africa will be rich and young, like Saudi Arabia, and so maybe they will get rich and young. It's not impossible that they will, but many also might get old before rich, in which case they might like to think about it as their demographic and economic transition emerges over the next decades, at least like China did. So can China get rich? Just as that scatter plot indicated, I won't go into this, but basically most countries now getting rich in terms of entering the high income group, including Mauritius recently, but it fell out. And not including Seychelles, which got rich basically when it was young and by most indicators. Most countries today are getting rich when they're old. Will African countries? Who knows? But even if they don't, this logic is still worth thinking about. So this at least is optimistic. If all these countries could get rich when they got old, probably China can too via its own pathway. However, this, going back to the paper I mentioned, these are the same years, so 1996, 2016 interval. If you look at the share of young countries in 1996 that were young and lower middle income, none of them became high income countries by 2016. So over that 20-year period, no country grew so rapidly that it became a high income country and got old. But 17.4% of them, of lower middle income young countries, did become upper middle income and old. But only, and then you have, whereas 37% got upper middle income while they were still young, and so on. So really, but what you see is the highest transition rate is the countries that were old and upper middle income in 1996, 70% of them were high income by 2016. So the highest rate of entrance to the high income group was from the countries that were old and upper middle income. Lower middle income also, but really old first is now a bit of a new norm, which doesn't mean it will be in Africa, but it may be, as it was for Mauritius, but thanks to COVID, Mauritius has dropped out again. So basically, what was China's agenda? I think I have to speed up. What was China's agenda? Its unique long-run economic demography approach was basically in the 1980s, they've got this one-child policy. They're going to fix a lower rate of population growth. Many countries achieve it without trying. China fixed that. And then they began really focusing on creating jobs for all these people born in the 60s and the 1950s and 60s. There's just, millions of people, they created jobs. By default of that, they captured their demographic dividend. And at the same time, though, aware that after the demographic dividend, you'd have a smaller population of working age that had to provide for all those old people, as well as keeping the economy modernizing, because China wouldn't be rich yet. So you have to kind of find a way that the effective labor supply doesn't fall even as the number of workers fall. And that included progressive investment in science and technology, at least in a small cohort of much more educated Chinese, and so on. So then by the time of the 2000s, China started focusing on making sure that its health and social security and pensions, at least at the very basic level, would be in place. So nothing grand for a lot of people, nothing generous, nothing that will bankrupt the country, presumably. but just something to make sure to reduce the chance of absolute poverty for hundreds of millions of old who hadn't got rich over the last 4 decades. And at the same time, this technology investments, higher education investments, and kind of, doubling up on that in the 2010s and then 2000. So you see the direction kind of swapping from the quantity of labor to the quality of labor, and preparing the society to cater to all these old pensioners in a sustainable, but hopefully in a humane and fair way. And so this is just a little link into the Africa story. So if you go back to the figure that showed which countries are still young and poor, or like China was in 1980, this partly helps to explain China's maritime Silk Road interest in particular. So most of the demographically young kind of potential for fast and catch-up growth countries are along the maritime Silk Road. So that's part of China's new external growth and investment push, just so you get that context. So what is the reference point? The reference point is what I was just saying, was to kind of constantly factor what, it just as a comparison. In Japan got old after it got rich. And so instead of the China story, you have quite expensive pensioners, living much longer and so on. And you have a smaller, younger cohort that is under very different but very intense pressure also, in part because Japan wasn't planning the way China was. You have to think, like, when you have a lot of old people, how should you change the tax system? Are the old people the rich ones, or are they the poor ones? And so on. So this constant kind of adjusting of the economics together with the demography. How do they interact over time? And how should you change policy accordingly? Even if you are Niger and your country is very young and low income, you can still have an effective, the same approach, but just to your own country's income and demography level. So you just see that's just the kind of stages I just set out. And now they have this means of, or this plan to proactively respond, so to population aging, so to develop healthcare services, to develop education for older people, to foster social harmony and so on. And then, of course, tapping into the improving national income distribution to make sure that aging doesn't massively undermine consumption, not that consumption is a big driver of growth in China. And really fundamentally now pushing into very capital intensive and labor, like educated labor areas of the economy, to make sure to capitalize on this, productivity per worker, to hold that constant, even though there's fewer workers, and to build make sure the effective labor stays constant, if not higher. None of that's necessarily easy to do, but that's the goal. I'll skip that. So, this kind of elemental policy, economic demography policy framework, what do you do? You're a young population country and you want to enjoy a demographic dividend. Not all countries maybe even want to push it or think about it, just leave the people to be free. Nonetheless, if your country does move in that direction, these are the kind of things to think about. Early demographic dividend prospect, getting ready for massive job creation, and accelerating, at least in the first, if you have a very young, like a high fertility rate country, maybe sparking that demographic dividend. So education and health investments, and then the job creation, and then with this one eye on the future for institutions for population aging. Older populations, this is kind of down the track, or Mauritius, Morocco might be thinking about capital intensive growth, much higher educated labor forms of growth, as well as taking advantage of pensions if there are pensions, or at least having appropriate pensions. So you have to think about these different things at each stages and prepare a step ahead. Obviously, African countries will have their own story, but and on top of that, where China grew when the West was super young and consuming and rich, the West in the 1980s and 1990s was also demographically young and prime, like Japan and so on. It's not now. So African countries will be exporting and trading with a different world economy to the one China did. So you have to factor other countries' economic demography transition too. I think I've spoken for too long already, so I'm going to stop there, and I hope that fits in the time. I hope it was understandable and useful. Thank you so much for listening. Bye.